if you want to understand universities, it's a bit like blind men trying to get a sense of an elephant. There's that famous story about blind men each feeling a different part of the elephant and going away with a different impression. So if you're a student, you understand the education. If you're a faculty member, you understand a different part of the university. If you're an industry partner, you look to the university for different things. So there are many views of a university, they're multifaceted, and no one view or one model will give you a rich picture of the university. So I'm going to take you through some views of the university. So Simon Marginson, a leading commentator today, talks about 3 established ways in which higher education is imagined or practiced. As an economic market, as a competitive status hierarchy, or as a collaborative global network. Now, who is Simon Marginson? Well, he's not a university president, he's an academic. He runs the University College London Institute of Education. But in 2014, he was the first non-American invited to give the Clark Kerr Memorial Lecture. So, amazing that he wasn't even a president. Most speakers are former presidents, and he wasn't even American. And in America, for them to admit that a non-American has something to teach them is kind of rare. He's Australian, by the way, before he went to work in the UK, and he's very familiar with Asian higher education and the movement of Asian students to Australia and all sorts of development. So he's really one of the leading commentators on higher education today. So back to his 3 imaginaries of higher education. The first one is higher education as an economic market. So back to let me overview the 3 first. Marginson explains that there are 3 powerful imaginaries at work in the higher education sector, widely known inside and outside higher education. These are associated with differing concepts and differing political, economic, and social interests. There are tensions between them. They also have a long history of coexistence. Together, they shape our sense of what is possible in higher education. The first imaginary is the idea of higher education as an economic market. Education and research are products, and higher education is economic competition between nations for tuition fees and talent. Universities are like business firms. So, if you are trading in economics, there's public goods and private goods. If you can prevent other people from accessing it without paying, and if by consuming it you prevent somebody else from consuming it, it's a pure private good. If it is something that multiple people can enjoy, and if there's no way of excluding them from enjoying it, it's a pure public good, right? So the cartoon here is about Pythagoras and somebody suggesting that he should have patented his theorem and he'd be a rich man. I just want to clarify that if he had patented it, it would have been a private good for a while, but once the patent runs out, the knowledge is free and it would transform back into a public good, right? So is knowledge, is research, is the well-educated graduate a private good or a public good? And we will find that most things are neither one or the other. So this is a sort of diagram I'll keep coming back to today. So hopefully we get sort of used to what I'm saying. Private goods on the vertical axis and public and part public goods in the horizontal axis. So an example of a almost completely pure private good would be graduating from a master's program in wealth management, right? Probably the only person who's going to benefit from that is the graduate himself. Society doesn't need too many of these graduates, right? Or patents and startups, right? These sort of accrue to the individual who owns them. Let me move to the second imaginary. So the second imaginary has older roots. This is higher education as a field of status, ranking, and competition. Universities provide their graduates with status, and universities bear their own institutional status. The higher education hierarchy, regulated by word of mouth and national and global rankings. My own observations are the same as Marginson's. From within research universities, the view from inside is that this status imaginary is the strongest of the 3. The bottom line for the university is its own prestige. The revenues are only a means to that end. The appeal of being able to claim status is hard to resist for most of us. So this is sort of like a metaphor for rankings, right? We know who's first, we know who's second, third, fourth. And there is something called Bowens Law, which is rather an observation rather than a law per se. Howard Bowen was a professor of economics and education at Claremont Graduate University from 1974 to 1984. He says, at any given time, the unit cost of education is determined by the amount of revenues currently available for education relative to enrollment. The statement is more than a tautology. It expresses the fundamental fact that unit cost is determined by hard dollars of revenue and only indirectly by considerations of need, technology, efficiency, and market wages and prices. What he's saying is cost expand to fill available revenue, right? So if that is true, normal economics says if you raise your prices, demand goes down. The only situation where this doesn't happen is for status goods or what we call Veblen goods. And you can see now why there's a strong incentive for universities to position themselves as status goods. Because if they have high status, they can raise prices and demand will stay high. Right? So there's a real strong reason for this particular view of universities, that they are it's a status prestige game. Now, this brings into the recent phenomena of rankings, etc. And if you want to, we can talk about rankings during the Q&A. The third imaginary is that of collaborative global networks. And it's potentially more egalitarian, and it's patterned by communication, collegiality, linkages, partnerships, and global alliances. Magnuson notes that this imaginary was always part of higher education. There were always people traveling from countries to universities to share knowledge, to exchange knowledge and bring it back home. But it has gained ground significantly in the last 20 years in an area of global communications. This is the imaginary that focuses attention on the creation of global public goods that don't just benefit your country, but benefit the whole world. I will discuss this imaginary in greater detail in the second half of today's talk when I talk about management universities and our alliance of management universities. Exploration, contingent assets, and functional redundancy are all extremely valuable, and research universities know this. It's in their DNA. There's lots of functional redundancy, there's lots of contingent assets, and they are exploring all the time. If you go to war, you will ask your researchers in physics or mathematics to work for the defense organization. It's a brain trust that benefits society. So this is what I wanted to say about research universities, and I hope you begin to get a sense of how they are as resilient as they are, how they've lasted 500 years when almost nobody else has. And the thing about those three aspects I talked about is it's hard to measure, but it doesn't mean it doesn't count, right? So in part two, I'm going to talk about management universities. And in the registration link, there was a link to an article that's been written by an international group of university leaders from Copenhagen Business School, Université Paris-Dauphine, Sengalen, Fundação Getúlio Vargas from Brazil, and SMU. And this was the title of that article in the Global Focus magazine that's published by the European Foundation for Management Development. And that's the group that does the EQUIS accreditations for business schools. So in that article, we talked about a whole diversity of institutions, and you could think for yourself, where would you put INSEAD, where would you put Harvard Business School, where would you put Harvard University, where would you put NUS Business School, where would you put SMU? And it sort of, that article, if you go back and read it, sort of talks about how each of them play a different role, each of them has evolved differently. Just briefly, you would have SMU here, where we have an emphasis on undergraduates and postgraduates. INSEAD would be postgraduate and executive ed, and it's probably a standalone business school, though they've probably diversified a little and come down here. And then you would have the NUS Business School within a comprehensive university, or IMD, which is another business-focused institution. So that was sort of the landscape. But what we talked about in that article about management universities was that there is an emergence of a new breed, more than business school, and including complementary disciplines such as information systems, law, and public policy to enrich the business subjects. As universities for business and management, this group is concerned that management education is narrowly perceived often as mostly a private good, with few benefits flowing to others besides the student and the private sector employers. These specialized universities intentionally pursue various positive social and economic externalities beyond pure private goods. And they believe that business is a part of society and not apart from society. So all the universities in this group were international, innovative, and seeking to make impact. And they share a conviction in the collaborative network mindset of working together, not just on national interests, but for shared interests that are wider and include national interests. Here's a little explanation of why we really believe we're different. We do innovation within tradition. We're not about to let Coca-Cola put an advertisement in front of every lecture. That's the wrong sort of innovation. Within academic values and academic virtues, we will innovate the way we teach, what we teach, etc. And without being too comprehensive or being too specialized, we have a small set of disciplines that sort of mix well together. They're complementary. They're not sort of a random set of 5 disciplines, but they are sort of carefully chosen complementary set. And to explain this, I'm going to use sports as a metaphor. Dick Fosbury, the guy who jumped backwards over the high jump bar the first time, he did it because he couldn't coordinate his legs and he couldn't do the method that everybody else was doing at the time. So necessity is the mother of invention. But once he did that, other people started following, and today every single high jumper uses the Fosbury flop, right? So he's innovation, but one event, right? He doesn't do anything else, but he did it in a really innovative way. There's this guy called Daley Thompson, who was my hero when I was a kid in the 80s. There was a Lucozade advertisement, right? If you Google it, you'll find it. He's incredible. 10 events, right? And if he was competing in the Berlin Olympics, he would have won 6 gold medals because 6 of his events would have been world records, right? If he was competing 10 years ago. But he was at a later time when he was a bit more competitive. He was undefeated from 1979 to 1987. But he does a lot of things, but he doesn't do them in any particularly innovative way, right? So impressive, but there's no innovation element. So I'm going to bring you to the example of how we think of SMU and our management universities. Here's Carl Lewis. His events are 100 meters, 200 meters, the long jump, and the 4x100 meters. He's got the most Olympic gold medals other than Mike Phelps and Mark Spitz in the water, right? So he's the most bemedaled Olympic athlete on land. How does he do this? No, I spoke to a friend who does track and field, and he says actually the long jump is training for the acceleration phase of the 100 meters. So every time he does a long jump, he's actually training for the 100 meters. And if you train for the 100 meters, you're sort of ready for the 200 meters. It's just a bit more. So it's a very efficient set of disciplines to take if you want to win lots of gold medals, right? It's complementary. But what's really amazing is, at the time when he was running, the 100-meter record kept being broken every month or so because the US 100-meter athletes were the best in the world at that time. But instead of competing with them, he got them together and he said, hey guys, let's go for the 4x100-meter record and let's break it together, right? So that's sort of the kind of thinking of going for a greater prize, collaborating with your rivals to do something together bigger than you could by yourself. And that's, to me, the ethos of this collaboration of management universities. Some people see us as rivals, but we see ourselves as partners. So what do we as management universities try to do? We try to pursue global public goods that not only benefit our country, but benefit the world at large. Socially responsible, internationally experienced managers. Most of us are very international. We send our students abroad. We have international faculty. We tend to teach about cultures beyond our own in our curriculum. And we do interdisciplinary research that has transnational relevance. So I'll give an example of transnational relevance. Say you're working on the economics of aging in Singapore, because we have an aging population. And you try to find out about whether people have enough retirement savings. Is that a topic that's relevant to Singapore? Yes. Do other countries have the same problem? Japan does, and many other countries will in time. So that's the sort of research that is both locally relevant and internationally important. Now, here's an unanswered question. what is the relationship between private goods and public goods? Some people think that if I produce something of this benefit, it's either public or private or a combination of both. It may be a zero-sum game. But what if I produce something that's a private good, but that leads to public goods? Or if I create a public good that helps facilitate the creation of private goods? Whichever model you take, there are assumptions about the relations between the two dimensions within social historical contexts. For example, private benefits such as access to professions, training of lawyers, etc., may lead to the creation of more public goods. In the real world, public and private benefits may be several, they may be joint, or maybe neither, right? Magnuson has argued that our model for imagining and practicing higher education must attempt to secure all these possibilities, that they are related, that they are unrelated, etc. Now, how can we push the envelope? Jean Tirole won the 2014 Nobel Prize for Economics for advising governments how to do auctions of telecoms, how to manage oligopolies, because most economists talk about either perfect competition or monopolies. He also talked about how to deal with tenders where there's asymmetric information. If only the telecom provider knows how much his cost is and whether he can innovate and bring costs down, how do you do a tender that incentivizes him to bring his costs down? Because he's not going to tell you just how much he can bring his costs down. So research like that, it is governance, innovation. He's coming up with new public policy recommendations which have been adopted by governments, but it then frees up the private sector to be more productive and create more private goods for us. Cyberspace is another big issue. We all benefit from having safe, secure cyberspace, but who's in charge? Private firms need to be responsible, private individuals need to change their behavior, and governments need to have laws and agreements with other governments that sort of facilitate this. So there is research in this area that sort of isn't either purely private or public, and it benefits all of us. And the management universities tend to work in this space. What do management universities have to do in this space? We can innovate both private and public goods, and we can manage the governance, not just locally, but across borders, for sustainable and equitable development. And this is sort of a special thing that you will see if you go back and you look at all the universities. We're worried about business, we're worried about business sustainability, we're worried about environmental sustainability. And that's something that we are sort of equipped to do because we have business, because we have law, because we have public policy, because we have infocom technology. And because we're small enough that all our professors talk to each other. They're not sort of spread across this huge sprawling campus where they don't sort of interact as much as we'd like them to. So, in an increasingly interdependent world, collaborative networks and partnerships can help create more of both private and public goods in a sustainable way. It's not a zero-sum game between states and markets. Management universities are ambidextrous. We have unique capabilities for innovation of both private and public goods. We have always sought to be embedded in our communities with our multiple stakeholders, but also remaining connected globally. We have governed ourselves for sustainability and have protected our sources of innovation. I said about our mix of disciplines, and that helps us develop managers. So Russell Ackoff was the founder of systems thinking, according to some people, and he had this nice classification for the difference between an administrator, a manager, and a leader. An administrator gets people to do what his boss wants them to do. A manager gets people to do what he wants them to do, and a leader makes people do the right thing because they want to do. Good, right? And so what we're doing is we are developing managers and hopefully some leaders. We don't teach business administration, we develop business managers. We develop managers for society. The next stage of this development for our Alliance of Management Universities remains an adventure. I can't tell you exactly where we'll go or what it will look like, but we keep discovering more institutions that have our DNA and share the same aspirations. In China, in Japan, in some parts of the US, where it's harder to find something that's not comprehensive or liberal arts college. Some say university should be a place where students are safe to fail, right? I tell my students, if you're pushing the boundaries and if you're innovating, there is no such thing as failure, there's only discovery, right? My colleagues from the management universities I found have the same sort of innovative, explorative, and high ambitions. We are excited about what we might do together. And I'll leave you with my sort of favorite quotation from Against Sailing, from a time when not all the oceans in the world were discovered. Man cannot discover new oceans unless he has the courage to lose sight of the shore. So with that, thank you very much.
So basically, I mean, the latest university rankings that came out, Singapore universities did pretty well, two of them, not yours, but NUS definitely did. What's the challenge for SMU and management universities like these? We're not so research intensive, but how do you then deal with not perhaps featuring as prominently in league tables because of certain criteria that don't reward non-research activities?
So first I have to correct you. It's not that SMU is not research intensive.
Okay.
It is research intensive, but it's small, and it doesn't have the full set of disciplines. The rankings sort of reward engineering and medicine because they sort of churn out research output on faster cycles than social science and humanities. So LSE, which is a fantastic institution, most parents would love to send their children to LSE if they had a scholarship. LSE used to be ranked about 60, and there were universities like I'm trying to remember, Bristol, that would rank higher than LSE because they were comprehensive, right? So you have to take these things with a pinch of salt. The rankings sort of collapse multifaceted dimensions of quality into one number, right? And that number loses a lot of detail. The big danger with rankings is what I call the Procrustean bed. Procrustes was this Greek metalsmith who would capture people and cut off their legs or stretch them to fit his metal bed, right? It's sort of force-fitting. If we all try to look like MIT and Harvard, we will all be poor MITs and Harvards, and nobody will be an excellent new thing. So I think it's sort of very painfully value damaging for the rankings to sort of play up one configuration of aspects, and everybody else is punished for sort of being different. For diversity and for sustainability, I think you really do need a diversity of institutions. And I think on August 3rd, you have a guest coming to Singapore, Phil Altepak. And I believe he's a big proponent of diversity in higher education.